In this series, we'll be taking a look at the AP Computer Science A 2016 free response questions. We'll be going through each problem individually, and we'll be coding a solution. So let's take a look at question 1. So question 1 involves an extension of a random string chooser class. And it says it's constructed from an array of non-null string values. When the object is first constructed, all of the strings are considered available. The random string chooser class has a getNext method, which has the following behavior. A call to getNext returns a randomly chosen string from the available strings in the object. Once a particular string has been returned from a call to getNext, it is no longer available to be returned from subsequent calls to getNext. If no strings are available to be returned, getNext returns none. The following code segment shows an example of the behavior of random string chooser. So we have an array of strings right here called word array, and this example array uses a list initializer, and it has 4 strings in it, which are wheels on the bus. And when we construct a random string chooser called schooser, passing word array into the constructor, so we're going to do that. And then there's going to be a for loop, which iterates from 0 to 6, and then it prints out schooser.getNext. So one possible output is shown below. Because schooser is only for string, the string none is printed twice. So bus the wheels on, and then none, and then none. So we're supposed to write our solution on the next page. Let's take a look. So it says to write the entire random string chooser class. Your implementation must include an appropriate constructor and any necessary methods. Any instance variables must be private. The code segment in the example above should have this indicated behavior. That is, it must compile and produce a result like the possible output shown. Neither the constructor nor any of the methods should alter the parameter passed to the constructor, but your implementation may copy the contents of the array. So let's start to get into this. So let's make our random string chooser class. So to start off making the class, we just have to say public class random string chooser. This will set up that class for us. So what we need to do is we need to set up at least 2 things. It's going to end up being 3, the way I'm thinking about solving this problem, but we definitely need a random string chooser constructor, which is passed an array of strings. And that's what's going to allow us to create this object, which has all of these values in it. Then we need to make a method called getNext, which has this prescribed mechanism. So it needs to randomly choose something out of the random string chooser object. It would essentially just, and then it is no longer available to be returned from subsequent calls to getNext, which means that we probably want to return it, or we will probably want to remove it. And then we want to print out, we want to return none if there isn't anything left to return, which is why it randomly chose bus first, then it randomly chose the wheels on, and then after that, there was nothing left to choose, so it simply returned none and then none. So I think the easiest way to go about doing this, while we could just use just a normal array, I think the easiest way to go about doing this, because we're removing elements from our data structure, is to just use a list. So let's make a instance variable. And remember that it says the instance variables have to be private. So we'll make it a private instance variable, and we're going to make an array list and template it for strings. And we'll go ahead and call it word list. That's fine. We also need to make a constructor. So our constructor should look like this. So public random string chooser, just like you set up any other constructor, you start with the word public, and then you have the name of the class here. And then you pass any parameters that you need to pass. So if you look at the way this code is written, it looks like we are passing an array of strings. So let's set this up so that we can pass in an array of strings into the constructor. So to set it up, we'll say string, and then word array, like that. We'll call it word array. Now essentially what we want to do is we want to first instantiate the array list word list. So to do that, we'll say word list gets new array list string. And then we'll actually go through word array and just add all of the strings from word array into word list, because it's going to be a lot easier to work on this since we're removing elements later. So I'll use an enhanced for loop for this because we're going to be iterating through an object. So I think it's just going to be a lot easier that way. I'll show you how you can do this without using an enhanced for loop as well if the concept of an enhanced for loop is for whatever reason confusing to you. We'll say for string word in word array, and all we have to say is word list dot add word. That should do everything we needed to do. Down here, I'm just going to go ahead and show you just an alternate way to iterate through it using a regular for loop. We could say something like for int index is 0, while index is less than word array dot length. The idea is that we want to iterate through word array here and grab all the elements from word array and then add them to word list, which is our array list that we're going to do stuff with later. Then we say index plus plus, and then in there we can just say something like word list dot add. So same thing we would have done before, except this time we just say word array index. These two for loops would just do the same thing, but I've seen people get confused about enhanced for loops, so I thought I'd just add a traditional for loop that would also do the same thing. So alternate loop. Okay. The last thing we need to do is write the getNext method. So we need to write the getNext method. A call to getNext returns a randomly chosen string, so the return type is going to be string, from the available strings in the object. Once a particular string has been returned from a call to getNext, it is no longer available to be returned from subsequent calls to getNext. If no strings are available to be returned, getNext returns none. What we're going to do, so we'll set up the method header. So we'll say public string, we're going to be returning a string, and then getNext. So what we need to do is essentially just say we want to return a randomly chosen word from the array, and if there is nothing left to return from the array list, then we just go ahead and return none instead. Since we return none essentially when there's nothing left in the array, let's start off with if wordList.size is equal to 0, we can say return that string none. That would just say that if there's nothing left to return, if we've removed everything else, at this point we can just return none. Because we don't want to access something from the array list, we don't want to access something that doesn't exist, because we would receive a null pointer exception if we tried to access something from an empty list. So now, we want to return a word, and then we want to remove it from the array list. So first of all, let's just select a random word. So we'll say string random word, and then that's going to be equal to, so we want to get basically a random index. So we'll say wordList.get, and then we need to put in our random index in here. And to get that, there are a few ways we can do this, but let's go ahead and use math.random. So math.random produces a random double between 0.0 inclusive and 1.0 exclusive. We can modify that as much as we want, and we can increase that domain as much as we want, and then cast it to an integer to make sure that we're getting an integer index value. If we say math.random times wordList.size, then essentially what we're doing is we expand that domain of the random number to be a random double between 0.0 inclusive and wordList.size exclusive. So that's close to what we want, but we don't want those decimal values. Just to get rid of those decimal values, we can cast that entire thing, math.random times wordList.size, to an int just by doing this. We put an int in front of it, just casts it to an int, so it's just going to chop off those decimal components so that all we have are just a valid index from word list. So now we want to remove this word from the array list while still being able to return that word. So we'll put return random word down there, but now we need to do our removal. I suppose what we could have done instead is just generated the random index value and then essentially just removed from that index value, and then just return words or random word dot remove and then that index value. But because of the way we did it, I forgot a semicolon there. So because of the way we did it, we're going to have to use the index of method of the array list. So what we can do is we can say word list dot remove, and then we need to get the index of random word in word list. So we'll say word list dot index of, and then random word. What dot index of does is it's going to return the index of the first instance of random word in word list. And this will work even if we have multiples of the same word, because it shouldn't really matter which particular string we're returning. We're actually more concerned about the value of those strings. So for example, if we had an array list that's just 3 instances of the word bookshelf, then even if we randomly selected the second bookshelf word, it's going to remove the first one, but that's still okay, because that's all we really needed to do in the first place. We just need to remove one of those instances of bookshelf. So this will work just fine. And then we just return random word, and this will be a fully constructed class. Here's an alternate way we could have done this, and I'll go ahead and put this down. I'll put this up here. We still want to have this check to make sure that we have something inside of word list, because if word list dot size is equal to 0, if there's nothing left inside word list, we definitely want to return none. So that's fine. But here's what we could have done instead, and this might be considered a more elegant solution, to be honest with you. But you know, both of these methods will work. So we just generate the index by saying int index, and then we basically just take what we had down here, the int, the math.random times word list dot size, and then we cast that to an int, just like we did down here anyway. But then what we can do is we can say return word list dot remove, and then index. So this is actually a bit more of an elegant solution. It involves actually returning exactly what you're removing, because the remove method of the array list class actually returns the object that you end up removing from that array list. So not only by doing this do you get to remove that data that you wanted to remove, but it's also returning it, which is exactly what we wanted the getNext method to do. So both of these blocks of code will work. They both will accomplish the same thing. So part B is a lot shorter than part A, but it's basically testing a certain bit of knowledge about how classes work in Java. The following partially completed random letter chooser class is a subclass of the random string chooser class. You will write the constructor for the random letter chooser class. The class random letter chooser extends random string chooser, which means that random letter chooser is a subclass of random string chooser. Random letter chooser has 2 things in it that we need to worry about. One is the constructor, and this is what we're actually going to implement ourselves using code. And then we have a method called getSingleLetters that returns an array of strings that's passed a string str. What it does is when it returns an array of single letter strings, each of the strings consists of a single letter from str. Element k of the returned array contains the single letter at position k of str. For example, if you pass the string cat into getSingleLetters, it returns the array cat, string c, string a, string t. And the following code segment shows an example of using random letter chooser. Basically, it's just doing what it did from part A, except now it's passing a string instead of an array of strings. But besides that, it's just going through each one, and it's just choosing a random letter out of these, and then it's going to print out none if we get to a point where we don't have any more letters or strings to print. This is going to be testing you on 2 things. When you invoke the superclass's constructor in a subclass, which we have to do here, that has to be the first line of your constructor. Now, the second thing we need to look at here, so if we go back to the superclass's constructor, that's actually passed an array of strings, like here. We need to have a way to get an array of strings and pass that into our subclass's constructor here. We would need to pass it into the superclass's constructor in our subclass constructor. Now, fortunately, we actually have a method that we can use to take this string and turn it into an array of strings, and that's getSingleLetters here. Because getSingleLetters, it's passed a string str, and then it returns an array of strings, which is exactly what we want. So all we really have to do is just say getSingleLetters and then pass str. pass str like that. And that would get you full points. So it's really that simple. So this question was really just testing to make sure that you knew that you had to call the superclass's constructor in the first line of the subclass constructor, and then use that helper method get single letters and pass str into it to get that array of strings.